Yahoo Prof here, and we're making the first live, relatively recent video in a while, and what it's going to be on is Ryzen 9000, the new CPUs that just came out, the 9600X as well as the 9700X, and what I think that a lot of people are getting wrong on it. A lot of people are claiming oh, it's the worst thing since Bulldozer, which is pretty harsh. It's definitely not. A lot are claiming that this is the smallest improvement we've seen in the longest time. I really don't think it is. And as somebody who's actually run, not personally in this case, we're still rocking a 5950X here, a 5800X3D, a 5700X3D, and even the 5600X3D in one of the systems. But I've ran Ryzen since the original 1700, 1800X. The 9000 series is not as bad as people say, though. And the reasoning there is, I feel like a lot of these people have forgotten what happened with the 7000 series. And what happened there is they came out at much higher TDPs than what was expected. And then they came out with eco mode. Now, there is eco mode this time as well, but PBO did very, very little, very little, when it comes to the 7000 series. In many cases, I found that it was just easier to do, not mess with PBO, just run it stock, to be truthful. Or actually, if you were running a single tower air cooler on a 7700X, run eco mode. You will actually, in many cases, things that don't do full core load, you will actually do better in some cases, from my experience. You will actually get better FPS because it's kind of like underclocking in a way. You're using less power, so the things that are being run can actually turbo higher. And what happened there is AMD, for those that don't remember, responded. And when the 7000 series came out, they were all super high wattage compared to the previous generations. And they would just hit their 95 C limit like that, no matter what you threw at them almost. And that was unexpected at the time, right? So, but that was to combat the 13900 and the 14900. I don't remember what was around that time. My brain fuzzy. It's effectively been the same thing though, because Intel raised their limits, right? So they let you turbo higher, turbo longer. In many cases, a lot of manufacturers are defaulting that, or they're saying it's okay. I mean, now we're finding out that that might have not actually been okay, but you know what I mean. So AMD had to hit back because they have to actually compete. If people are running these Intel chips like that. So effectively, what it ended up being is out of the box, a lot of these CPUs were effectively PBO out of the box. I've built 3 systems with 7700Xs. One of them ended up after a CPU dying, going to a 7800X3D. So there's a stuff there in that I actually have expertise, but experiencing using these in multiple different systems and running myself. The other thing, at least based on my experience, and this is something I did find anecdotally through other YouTubers out there, like Jay's 2 Cents was complaining about degrading DRAM speeds on his system that he was running at home. And this is actually something that I was seeing on one of the 7700X based systems. If you're running besides that, I've also built a 7950X and a 7950X3D system. And you can almost treat the 7800X3D system effectively got rebuilt during that because the motherboard also failed. It was one of these issues where I've had two systems. Both were 7700Xs, bought on or very near launch, with two different motherboards, but all on or near launch. And in motherboard was bad in two of those cases, and in one of those cases, now these are the same case, like one of those two, the CPU also ended up being bad. And I went into that in other videos as to like how that was, but that's for somebody who's only built 5 7000 series motherboards and 3 7700X ones, that's pretty bad. Now, this video is not about that, but what I found, like I said, if you were running a single tower air cooler, everything's to the Hyper 212, or in this case, there's a Be Quiet RGB one we were using, and there was the Redux Noctua, what is it? It's like the U12R is the Redux version, I think. Single fan, single tower coolers. Now, one of them we upgraded to a dual fan with a higher speed fan on it. It did help a little bit. A lot of those just fared better in eco mode. And a lot of people were surprised with the 7000 series coming out as so high temperature and so high TDP at the time. But realistically, this is because Intel was also juicing their chips. The rumors were that initially that these 7000 series were supposed to come out of the box effectively in eco mode, which would be what we're seeing right now, right? There's 65 watt parts for the 9000 series, and that is why like peak single core performance, you're not seeing it. In some cases, it might even lag behind 7000 series, right? But then most cases in multi-core, it is still doing better, or in things that can take advantage of the architectural change there. A lot of people are finding that actually, in this case, they're quote unquote super overclockable, or PBO actually does something. Well, like I said, this is because the other ones, especially when we got like there's a 7700 non-X with a much lower TDP. Heck, if you take a look at the 5900 non-X was actually a super popular one. I think the 5900 XT, where it's a 16 core now instead of a 12 core, could also be quite popular. But I know the 7900, and people are like, nobody buys the 7900. Those always go on sale, especially like the 7900 X3Ds. Well, yeah, you want the 7900 non-X, super low TDP with 12 cores, like even more than 8 cores, depending on what you're using. If you're using it more like a workstation and you're more CPU, you can benefit from those cores. That's lower wattage. You can fit that. Like if you're building an ITX system, if running, you will run eco mode if it's a 7000 series part, if it's an ITX system. And then you might as well, why do that? Why not even start out with a lower part? And for one of the three systems that were 7700Xs, we were actually going to buy a 7700. But with the sales AMD did, because it was the third one that wasn't done on launch, because the 7700 non-X was out by then, but they put the X on sale for the same or cheaper than the non-X. So it's like, well, we can just buy the X and put it in eco mode, and say if you buy a better cooler down the line, like a big fat all-in-one cooler like a 240 or 360, we can always take off eco mode and enable PBO. And that's what we did, and it's been working great. With that Noctua Redux cooler in eco mode. And like I said, I've even done it with some systems that had bigger coolers. Within one of the three 7700X systems did have an AIO. And we were playing around with PBO on it. Actually, it's one behind me there. And it can still be, I think it's like a 240 in there. That can still be not enough, because with the higher wattage, they bump off that 95C. Now, in the 9000 series, which is Zen 5, supposedly the IHS, which is the metal lid on the top of the CPU, has not been adjusted at all, right? What they did do is put the thermal probe in a better location. And everybody's saying, well, it's not running actually any cooler, it's just where they put the thermal probe. Well, these are 65 watt parts, so you would expect, even without the thermal probe moved, the 65 watt part to run cooler than the 105 watt part. Like, logically, this just makes sense. And I wonder, like, I don't know if we haven't had too many testing because there's been a lot of incompatibility coming out here. And even with some, I think it was Gamers Nexus, like, not benchmarking the 9600X because of all the instability they were having. And what was weird is that supposedly within a month or so, and remember, these were already delayed, the new motherboards will be out. I don't know why they just didn't wait for the new motherboard launches. Maybe they want to stay in the advertising realm for longer, but I think it was the incorrect decision. I think they should have launched the motherboards at the same time as the CPUs. And a lot of this could be a GISA because we're talking launch, like last-gen motherboards with launch GISA for these CPUs. Now, I'm not saying it looks good. It doesn't. That there's like stability stuff, etc., etc. But not surprising, I guess, on a launch new part that you aren't pairing the new motherboard with, but it's not their fault. They can't. You know, like apparently J2Sense, I believe, had issues specifically with the 9600X, which is the 6-core, which, to be truthful, I don't know if I would recommend you buying. There are so many things nowadays, even if you ignore gaming. Like, a lot of these people are like laser focusing on gaming because, you know, they said there would be some improvement in gaming with this. But you can game great on a 5000 series part. I do it not every night. You think I have time to game every night? No. Hopefully at least once or twice a week. Sometimes that doesn't even happen though. And I'm on a 5950X. We're great. On the home theater PC, we're on a 5700X 3D. Squares has my 5800X 3D. And that lower clock speed on the 5700X actually got me just enough temperature and I don't know what I'm going to say, like necessarily TDP, but like got me just under, so it wasn't throttling anymore. Basically, it was hitting the top temp for an X3D part, and then we'd start dropping clocks, and X3D parts do not like that. They just don't. So that the 5700X3 was actually a better fit for the home theater PC, where I have a restriction on the cooler that can be in there because it's a top-down cooler. And I also personally have a restriction on silence. I mean, it's a home theater PC. You know, I don't want, you know, like that sort of thing over there. Both those game beautifully. You know, so the stuff we're seeing here, in summary, like I don't know if it's necessarily a reduction in the performance of 9000 series, but these are 65 watt parts, and if you go back to 7000 series, those were initially rumored to be lower wattage than the 105 watt parts they were. And if you do run them in eco mode, from my experience, because I have done that in 2 of 3 of the builds I've done for the 7700X, not the 5950X 3D, by the way, just don't touch those. You're better off on an X3D part, just huck it in there, go. In my opinion, they're just so picky. Most everything I've done, like you can do PBO on, I don't know if it's PBO, but you can adjust stuff on the 5800X 3D after like some newer BIOS updates. But every time I've ever tweaked it, it's only gone worse. Like you're better off just not touching it. But you know, if we talk in 7700X, which is 7000 series, I've experienced with 3 of them. And like I said, of those 3, 2 builds had motherboards go bad. One of those 2 builds with no bad motherboard also had a bad CPU. So I don't think the experience, like I've had quite a bit of experience when there. And the eco mode, like how people are saying these 9000 series chips are acting stock, reminds me very much of how eco mode was in 7000 series. Then there was the whole rumor with 7000 series that it was supposed to come out at a lower wattage, but they couldn't do that. Like they had to basically come out with them running PBO out of the box because Intel unlocked their chips out of the box. Like basically they removed their turbo limits. They increased their wattage turbo targets, like to the point where the Intel TDPs are I mean, like TDPs are already kind of irrelevant on how they're like figured out, but like even if you went about how Intel did it, once it started turboing, like it basically completely ignored that. The only time you'd see chips that actually followed that were in OEM systems, like, Dell's, HP's, and even sometimes we're talking like business systems. A lot of you say like, oh, it's holding back performance, or to have little beer can cooler. In many cases, those aren't, because they're locked to Intel stock stuff. I deal with those. That's what I do on my day-to-day. I mean, I guess not anymore so much. I'm more on a different part of IT, but for many years, I was fixing those, like servicing them, like on-site tech stuff. So, like, there's a reason why they exist like that, and also these brands don't want to change their chassis and their coolers, etc. But everybody's like, oh, it's so much worse, and if that's where I'm wondering if we get these 9000 series Zen 5 PBO benchmarks. I wonder if they're kind of like how I was watching Wendell from Level 1 Techs. Check his stuff out. I love Links with Friends. It's not the N-word. Not Linus's N-word either. Links with Friends, Wendell, and then he was going over with his benchmarks. He was seeing very large improvements where you can make up some of this gap if you can get them. They have a new feature for tuning RAM, and you can make up a lot of that by getting it faster RAM and tuning it. Now, you have to remember, a lot of people, at least from my experience, I had never had any problem with G.SKILL RAM running 6,000 megahertz. A lot of other creators did, but every time I noticed them running into issues running 6,000 megahertz, they'd be running not G.SKILL. I'm not saying everybody has to run G.SKILL, but I've just had very good ever since Ryzen first gen, and they came out with their Flare X, and it was Ryzen certified. They were the first brand to really come out with that. Like, Corsair had one set for when the 17 and 1800X launched, but G.SKILL certified a whole lineup. And ever since then, I've pretty much stuck to them when doing AMD builds, as it's really no nonsense for them, especially once Expo came out. And I think it's 6000 CL30. I could be wrong there. I'd have to look up here while we're chatting, but I think that's what we were running. And I think Wendell talked about running 6200. I think some people towards the end of 7000 series, once it got a bit more developed, they were able to run 6200. But 6,000 for 7,000 was what, like, AMD was kind of like, if you're going to run, like overclocked memory or whatever you want to call it, that is what we would recommend, is 6,000 at max. Let's see here. RAM, 32 gigs. 32 gigs of, CL30. So 6,000 CL30. What Wendell was showing is that if you can get fast enough RAM and actually get the fabric speed up, then the CPU can actually, like, it gains back a lot of that stuff. Now, you have to remember that a lot of people run 7000 series with faster than stock RAM. Like, AMD recommends like 5600 as like the rated speed, not the overclocked speed. And most people are sticking to that since this is an initial launch of this. So I wonder how that'll play in. But I would not be surprised as more of these benchmarks come out with people trying overclocking on the 9000 series, or just enabling PBO and tuning it, where you see all of that clawed back. Now, it's going to be bumping, probably, maybe not bumping off the 95C limiter like 7000, since they adjusted where and how that temperature probe works, which is probably good, because previously it was basically useless because it would just smack 95C and... So, and I've had a previous video about this, about how you're going to have to adjust your fan curves, because now your fan curves on 7000 series, it's basically like set the max RPM as loud as you want your PC, because normally on a normal PC, the fan curve, like once it gets above 90C, it just maxes out the fans, right? Well, on 7000 series AMD, you were always above 90C. You were always smashing 95C. Well, if you have 3,000 RPM fans, not that you should, but, like, say a lot of the Noctus are 15, 1,800, 2,000 RPM, depending on your model. A lot of other brands, like when they include them with their heatsink to get better benchmark numbers, because a lot of places use the included fans, they'll include like 2,000 or 2,500 RPM fans. Like, they'll just be screaming, because it is it's above 90C, and it will always be above 90C, so they're always going to remove it at 100%. And maybe you don't want to hear your computer, so you're going to tweak that. So now your performance is actually limited not by like the CPU, right? It's actually limited by your fan speed and how loud are you willing to let your PC go, right? And this is when I noticed that, that's when I started to really look into eco mode and see on the 7000 series, like what could be done there. Like, can we get this down to a reasonable volume level if we just use eco mode? Like, yeah, top level performance might not be as high, but is the computer like better to live with, right? And the answer is yes. Same sort of thing. I would be interested in seeing benchmarks with 9000 series in eco mode, because I would expect it's probably not going to make the huge kind of difference that it did on 7000 series. Because they're back in 7000 series, eco mode on an X chip kind of brought it back down to what it was supposed to be, brought it back down to stock. And everybody equated the non-X 7000 series to basically running a X series in eco mode. That was the general thing. So it's like you could get them, like originally the thought was you can get them cheaper, lower TDP, better compatibility, especially in smaller systems, stuff like that. Like I said, we almost picked one up, except the cost of the X was I think it was $10 less or something. It's like, well, it might have even been more. It was a better deal to go with the X and just turn on eco mode than it was to buy the non-X. Because at least later down the line, say like I said, we slap that AIO in there, we can maybe even turn on PBO. Same thing happened to me in first gen Ryzen. I wanted a 1700 because it was going in my ITX rig Chibi PC, which is down there. I'm cramming a Noctua D15 Gen 2 in there. Slight modifications, sadly. And even Noctua was like, oh, you're going to have to accept that the performance won't be as good as it should be or something like that. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's got to fit. Fitting better performance, But I wanted the 1700 for the same reason, lower TDP. But there was a screaming deal at Micro Center. I believe it was one of their like Black Friday or Thanksgiving deals, And it was literally would have cost me more to buy a 1700 than a 1700. It's like significantly, like $100 or something. So I went with 1700X, and that thing ran actually was in the server less than a year ago. So it's had a long life. But yeah, that's in summary. Like I said, I think a lot of people are getting this wrong. In that they're like, oh, poo-pooing Ryzen 9000, and oh, it's not the performance increase we expected, and blah blah. Actually, it is, because with the lower TDP and lower heat output, it is beating in multi-core and still effectively the same in single core. And you're like, oh, well, we don't want CPUs that are the same. It should be an improvement everywhere, and that's what you want to see, and blah blah blah. I don't disagree, but if we go like compute per watt, I bet, and I don't, it's only been on for a short period of time. I don't know if and when people will start doing those numbers, but I have a feeling it's compute per watt is going to be much higher. I also think for a lot of you out there not building water-cooled systems or don't want to buy those massive 360 millimeter radiators, you're going to be in a much better situation with 9000 series. I don't know. That's just my thoughts. From my experiences. Let me know what yours are down below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? We'll see you in the next video. Peace.